Hallo, liebe Fotopodcast-Hörerinnen und Fotopodcast-Hörer. Heute gibt's noch einmal einen Rückblick in 2024 nach Baden, denn da liegen noch so ein paar Schätze bei uns hier auf der Platte und diesen wollen wir euch auf jeden Fall zugänglich machen. Es ist wieder ein englischer Beitrag, aber auch hier denken wir wieder, dass es sich absolut lohnt, das Gehirn mal auf Englisch umzustellen und zuzuhören. Wir hören David Turnley, wie er vor seinen Bildern spricht, nicht so viel über seine Bilder selber, sondern sehr berührt und berührend, ganz warmherzig erzählt er aus seinem Leben, über seine Liebe zur Fotografie, seine Zugewandtheit zu den Menschen ist in jedem Satz spürbar. Und dann berichtet er also, wie es zu dem ikonischen Bild gekommen ist, für das er auch sehr bekannt ist, das Bild von Nelson Mandela nach seiner Freilassung. Wie es dazu gekommen ist, wie er überhaupt in diese Art der Fotografie gekommen ist, über sein Aufwachsen, über seine Liebe zu Paris. Also David ist ein sehr, sehr feinfühliger Mensch. Das merkt man, wie er spricht, wie er über Menschen spricht, wie er Menschen beobachtet. Und es ist schon sehr besonders, dass er so offen über sich und sein Leben gesprochen hat, zu uns Zuhörern und Zuhörerinnen dort auf dem Artist Walk. Und ihr könnt es jetzt auch hören, denn er hat so vorher kein Interview eingewilligt. Also das macht er eigentlich nur, wenn er Menschen kennt. Und umso erstaunlicher ist es eigentlich, dass er hier so viel erzählt, was so persönlich ist. Also jetzt geht's gleich los. Macht die Ohren auf, macht das Herz auf und macht die Augen auf und guckt dann auf unserer Homepage auch die Bilder an, die er gemacht hat aus Paris und die er gemacht hat in Michigan. Und ja, viel Spaß.
And now it's my honor, and it's so easy to introduce the man next to me. I think we could do it similar to Martin Parr. It is David Turnley. David Turnley. David Turnley. And he's not completely alone. He's a little bit with his twin brother here. And because he couldn't come, so he will drop a few sentences about his work or their common life path for a certain time in life as well. So, welcome, Mr. David Turnley.
Thank you so much, Luis. I want to, first of all, just thank Luis and Sylvia. This festival and to all of you is wonderful. And I want to thank Cyril because he curated both of my exhibits. Can you hear me? Okay, I'll try to speak so that you can hear me. So 2 nights ago, I'm sitting in my apartment in Paris where I live with my wife, who's here. Where are you? Rachel, and my daughter, Dawson. Dawson, come here for a sec, please. Because she's really the star of the show. So 2 nights ago, I'm talking to her about what should I say to this audience in La Gacellie. And she disappears into her bedroom and she comes back with an iPad and she has written, "Hello, my name is David Turnley. I photographed Nelson Mandela. That's all you have to know." But she's kind of right, actually. And I was thinking as we're walking along that I could sort of try to do these kinds of talks, which have been brilliant, by the way, to connect with the photographs, but it's really a little difficult. So I'm going to tell you a good story. Is that okay? And the story won't go long, but it's a story that involves also my twin brother, and I think the story may tell you a lot about who I am and who we are, and hopefully maybe why I do what I do and a little bit my motivation. So, in 1985, I was working at a newspaper in Detroit, and at that time, Detroit was incredibly segregated. There had been race riots in 1967, and the city had gone from being 50% white, 50% black to about 90% black, 10% white. And it also coincided with the suburbanization of America, so there was this white flight that was happening. And Detroit was really the iconic city in America that was revealing the division in America. And I was very sensitive growing up in a family that was very involved in the civil rights movement. Dr. King had been my hero. And I was photographing the realities for people of color in Detroit, which had not been done previously. And it occurred to me one day in 1985, as I was following very closely what was going on in South Africa, that actually I should go to South Africa because I believed in joining the struggle against apartheid. But I also thought that if I could make photographs in South Africa that revealed the indignations and humiliations of prejudice, that people in Detroit could see this and they might learn something about the notion of dignity, of humiliation, of dismissal of people. And the newspaper sent me. It was meant to be about a 6-week assignment. As I arrived in South Africa, the country was exploding, and every day, for what was meant to be a 6-week assignment, I was up and down the country in the middle of riots in townships all over the country. And in fact, what was meant to be a 6-week assignment turned to be many years of my life. And I was one of the last international photographers to have received a visa from the South African government, and my photographs were being distributed by Black Star all over the world to magazines around the world, and it was an incredible privilege to wake up every day and contribute to the struggle. In late 1987, it was an honor that I'm about to offer to you that won't seem like an honor. I was actually kicked out of South Africa by the white regime because my work was having too much effect around the world. And it was a kind of compliment in those days. There were 11 journalists that year that were kicked out of South Africa. I went to Paris, where I was based, to cover the world. And I couldn't go back to South Africa for the first 2 years. I was persona non grata. And in 1990 in Paris, I received a phone call. Mr. Turnley, this is the ambassador from the embassy in South Africa. I'd like to have lunch with you. And I was quite confused and, to be honest, a little bit suspicious. And I said, sure, we can have lunch. And I go to this very fancy 5-star restaurant in Paris and meet this very large ambassador from the South African embassy who sits in front of me and says, Mr. Turnley, things are about to change in our country, and we want people with your credibility to go back and cover those changes. And I frankly really was suspicious. In those years, the white regime would do anything to destroy the integrity of journalists or photojournalists whose work was having an effect. And I said to him, I will accept your visa under 2 conditions. Number 1, that the visa has no conditions. And number 2, that I pay for lunch. And the man looked at me and said, I have no idea why you want to pay for lunch, but of course. And I took a flight that night to Johannesburg. And I arrived in Johannesburg to find out the next day that Nelson Mandela was being released on November 11th in 1990, just several days later. And that's why I was being asked to return to South Africa. And this had been a dream of mine, as it had been for millions of people around the world. And my twin brother was at that time working as the photographer based in Paris for 25 years for Newsweek, and he had arrived in South Africa. And on the night before, we called Nelson Mandela Madiba. That's his tribal name, and those of us who knew him well, that was how we called him affectionately. And Madiba was meant to be released the next day at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I got a very good night's sleep that night because I knew I was going to be up very early and work very late, and I wanted to be sharp, and I knew it was going to be an incredible day. And around midnight, I received a phone call, and it's a colleague of mine from a South African photojournalist. He said, David, you know I love you, but the South African Photographers Union decided today that tomorrow's event is going to be a pool event, and there will only be 5 photographers allowed in front of the prison. And I said to my friend John, I said, John, you know that I love you and I respect you, but if you think for 1 second that I will not be in front of that prison tomorrow morning, you're crazy. And I called my brother and I said, Peter, we have a problem. We have to get out in front of that prison very early tomorrow. And we agreed, and we arrived in front of the prison. It was the prison that Mandela was held in before he was released, was a medium security prison outside of Paarl, which is about 45 minutes from Cape Town. And we arrived in front of the prison, and there were 2 Afrikaner prison guards who were the people that guarded prisons in those years. And we went to these 2 guards and we said, you know what's about, we shook their hands, and with much dignity, because I always believe in that, as does my brother, I said, you have 2 choices today. You can become part of something that's going to be historically important to the entire world, or you can allow only 5 photographers to be in front of this prison on what is probably one of the most important days in the history of the world. And what we need you to do is to give us a rope, and we promise you we will create a pen for the photojournalist that is about 30 feet wide, and we will self-police ourselves so that we don't, as the argument had been that there will be decorum on this particular day. We will make sure that we behave, but the world needs to see this moment. And they agreed, and they got us a rope. And we set up our 30-foot pen, and from about 4 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, photojournalists from all over the world arrived, and before the afternoon, at 4 o'clock, when there were helicopters overhead, and every television station in the world was waiting to watch Madiba walk out of prison, there were probably 250 photographers standing behind me, and I hadn't moved for probably what was 12 hours to protect my space that was about this big. And I knew that the moment that Madiba would walk out with Winnie, that I would probably have, before the crowd broke, about 3 frames to make. And this was before autofocus cameras and auto exposure cameras. And I was working with a 300-meter lens. And Winnie showed up late, as she tended to do. And Madiba walked out of prison at 4:15. And as he walked out of prison, I made 3 frames. And the crowd broke just as I expected. And fortunately, my 3 frames were in focus, and it's one of the most important photographs that I've ever made. They got in their car. There was a motorcade into Cape Town. The motorcade lasted for about 45 minutes, and I got in a car and raced behind them. And when we got to the city hall in Cape Town, there were probably more than 150,000 South Africans who had spent their entire lives waiting for Madiba to walk out of prison and to address South Africa. And when Madiba and the motorcade arrived, Nelson Mandela had not seen a crowd in 27 years. And he apparently really he asked the driver to please quickly drive him out of the city. In the meantime, I had entered the crowd, and the crowd was dangerous. It was one of those crowds I've been in crowds all over the world, and crowds, as we know, can be dangerous. This was a dangerous crowd, not because they were dangerous, but they were so excited. And I literally had to climb on the shoulders of people just to basically survive. And I effectively walked on the shoulders of the crowd to get on the balcony in front of Cape Town. Now I'm suddenly in a position where if Madiba does arrive, I'm effectively in many respects out of position. So I walk into the city hall, and I sort of panically race down a hallway, and I open the first door thinking that maybe I can find a window to lean out of. Well, it so happens when I open the door, standing in front of me is the reception committee that involved Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the leaders of the anti-apartheid movement, including the family of Nelson Mandela. And they all knew me, and they said, "David, come in, but please be quiet. Just go to the back." And there were probably about 15 of us. And the world had no idea. The people outside had no idea. And suddenly there's a phone call. And Archbishop Tutu takes the phone. And we hear him say, "Papa, you have to come. Just show your face or they'll tear the city down. You just have to at least show up." And suddenly there's silence, and he puts the phone down and he said, "He's coming." And 5 minutes later, the door opens, and in walks Nelson Mandela. And I made the first photographs of Madiba. And as he walked in, the crowd didn't know he was in the room. The family was all there. Everyone's crying. And at one point, Archbishop Tutu takes a glass, and he takes a fork, and he sort of knocks the glass to get some silence. And he looks at Nelson Mandela, I'm going to make my daughter Nelson Mandela. And he looks at Nelson Mandela, and he says, "Papa, Baba, you have no idea what your life has meant to my life." And he started to cry, and everyone started to cry. And he stood there so dignified, and afterwards, and everyone else sort of said their piece. And then he said, "Please, you have to forgive me. I have to take care of something." And he stepped out of a window onto a balcony and spoke to the world for the first time in 27 years. That's the kind of life I've had the privilege to live. And it's the kind of dedication that one has to have to do this kind of work. And throughout all of these years that have been really 40 years, I came to Paris when I was 19 to meet Henri Cartier-Bresson and met him when I was living in a 75 franc a month studio, maid's room next to Notre Dame, selling ice cream below and studying French at the Sorbonne. And the director of photography at the New York Times had seen the work of my brothers and mine from the time we were 17 to 19, where we photographed the life on a very disadvantaged street in our industrial hometown in Indiana. And I had taken this work to Magnum, and the director of Magnum saw the work and said, "My God, you guys can do this work. Let me make a few calls." And she calls Gene Smith, and she calls Bruce Davidson, and she calls the director of photography at the Museum of Modern Art and the director of photography at the New York Times, who had been the director of Magnum. And she sends me around, and they all said the same thing. They said, "Look, you guys can do this. This is a world that is very competitive, and no one will ever hold your hands, but get out there and do this because you have what it takes." And we've sort of never looked back. And all of these years I've lived in Paris, and I go home to Paris, and I share this story. Paris is a place where the great photojournalists of our time have lived. Why? Because French know how to get places fast. They grow up in a culture where people travel in August. They go visit countries. It's a country where the mentality is very versatile to get to know the world. And as such, it's a country, and Paris being very centrally located has always been the place where photojournalists go to work for agencies that quickly respond to the most important world events in the world. And Peter and I have both lived there really since 1975, most of our lives. And I always tell this story that the kind of people that have done the kind of work my brother and I have done, it's a very small group. It's sort of like Formula One race car drivers. There's about 20 of us who we see all the time, all over the world. It's a very competitive world. And we were two of those 20, and we would always see the same people. And it's an incredibly competitive world, but at night we would sit down and eat together, and we don't talk about our work. We don't talk about competition. We talk about our families. This is what the French do, and it's why I've always loved living in France. And then you go back to work the next morning. But that moment has always been really special. And there's a time when you're just tired. You've been in a location in a war zone for a month, and you just hit a wall, and it's like, okay, I can't do this. I have to go home. And you would look at and I'll say this in French to Cyril, as if Cyril is one of my French colleagues. I would go to my colleague and say, "Putain, Cyril, je rentre sur Paname." And everyone knows what that means. It means, my God, I have to go home, and I'm going home to Paris. And that everyone knows what that means. You're going home to softness. You're going home to sensuality, to beauty, to love. And that's what these pictures are that I've been doing over these last 50 years. And that's really all I'm going to offer you today. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your festival.
What a man. What a man. So what are we going to do next?
Well, we're working on this. I wake up every day. First of all, let me thank Leica. This is my mistress and has been for these last really 50 years. Thank you, Leica. I wake up, and I don't say that as a commercial. This has a soul to it. And when I wake up in the morning, put this around my neck, and I have never walked out of my house without this around my neck. Because there's something that can happen around every corner. Edward Bouba used to say, David, je vais le dire en français, après je traduis. David, quand tu te lèves le matin et tu pars, amène ton boîtier avec un peu de noir là-dedans. Et quand tu promènes pas comme ça. Garde la tête comme ça, parce que si tu fais ça, tu risques de voir un cadeau autour de chaque coin. So what he was saying was, David, when you wake up in the morning, put a little black and white in your camera. And when you walk outside, don't walk like this. Walk with your eyes like this. Because if you do, you risk to see a gift around every corner. And that's the way I feel with this. And it allows me to work very intimately. And the way I work, I want to implicate myself always. I want you to feel me, and I want to feel you. And I have to win your confidence and work with you. It's a collaboration all the time. And this allows me to do that. Yeah. So thank you, Andreas Kaufmann and Karin Kaufmann and Leica.
And just to add, when you speak with him, I remember when we were in the coffee, he was with the Leica, and I speak to him to explain how is the gassy, and every 2 minutes, sorry, and he showed me a picture of me, a picture of me, a picture of me.
J'adore photographier. I love photography because he has what I always call la lumière dans les yeux. He has the light in his eyes, as Lois does, as so many of you have.
Really?
And for me, I wanted to say one more thing. What's important for me with this, and I learned this when I was very young. My father, I was very gifted. When we woke up in the morning, my father was an orthodontist. He had been a great athlete. My mother was a concert pianist. So there was always music and movement in my life. But there was something else. When we woke up in the morning, my father would get ready to leave. And before he left, he would turn around and he would look at us and he would say 3 things. First of all, today, stay low, which meant be in the game. Secondly, hit them harder than they hit you, which didn't literally mean that. It meant whatever you do it with the most passion you can find. And then the last thing he would say is, and have fun. And when he came home at night, he would come up to our bedroom and he'd say, how'd you have fun today? Now, why do I tell you that? Because for me, photography is about vitality. Vitality is the range of life. It's not just great life. It's also the difficult life. But it's exactly the opposite of indifference. It's caring. And that's what I try to photograph.
I would like to share with you how David has fun. He was here about a month ago for an artist talk upon the invitation of Christian and the Lower Austrian Photographer Society, and I picked him up at the hotel and said, come, I'll show you your exhibition. And we drove over here, and we spent here roughly an hour. But I'm not sure if he has seen his own exhibition at that point, because he was constantly photographing people who were watching the exhibition and asking for the name to punch into his cell phone and the age of the daughter in the cabbage and the car and all these kind of things. So he's a very, very special character with a camera. Very special.
And I have had the privilege, so I'm 69 years old. And I came to Paris in 75, and I met Henri Cartier-Bresson and his wife Martine Fonck at their house, at their apartment. And they were very important to me. And in the same year, I became very, very close friends with André Kertész and his wife Elizabeth, and Marc Ribou and Joseph Koudelka. My brother was Robert Doisneau's assistant. So I have had the privilege to know the real humanist photographers in the history of photography. So everything I'm sharing with you has also been imparted to me by these people. And I'm forever grateful. So thank you. And Lois has this, look at this festival that he and Sylvia have done with Joanna, who's so great, who I think she's always getting me cabs and everything, and it's all so perfect. But this is what they have put together. And I've been listening to all these presentations. Last night was very special. And yes, to be around people that care about something, wow, it doesn't get better than that.
Thank you, my dear friends.